Okay, guys, it doesn't look like anybody can make it again tonight. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to continue on from last week's recording, which I put onto the VLE for you to access later. Because the two units, 1 and 2, do overlap in a number of areas, and I've explained that on the suggested evidence sheet, that while you are talking about all the preparations and how you go about the IQA process, you'll be gathering examples of factual or documentary evidence that you're going to be able to use for a lot of the work in Unit 2. So some of these PowerPoints will overlap. So we're looking first at, we finished off with LOs 1 and 2 last week, and we'll look at 3.1, sampling assessment, sampling plans, assessor qualifications and experience, control units, observation, and the use of audio-visual technology. There's a wide range of things on here. The initial one is sampling plans. Now, a number of plans, a number of methods or templates you can have for a plan, but mainly they need to be quite simple and straightforward and just cover what is going to be sampled, from which learner or student, and when it's going to be sampled. Now, in academic work, the work will come in and it'll be assessed as you go along, and each unit, well, once it's complete, will be complete assessed as well. Now, in an ideal world, then that will be passed through for IQA and subsequently put into registry to await completion. But the sampling plan is the initial part where the IQA will decide with a cohort of students on a particular qualification. He must sample across the qualification. In other words, if there are 8 units in the qualification, then he will have to sample all 8 units, and those will have to be spread across the learners. Now, if you've got 8 learners, that means only 1 each, which is okay if you know the assessor and you know the level of experience and knowledge he has. If it's someone that is new or has not assessed the qualification before or only a few times, then you would have to look at going probably more than that and doing at least 2 on each one. Conversely, if there were only 2 students, whether the assessor was competent or new to the assessment process, you would have to cover 4 units from each of the each of the students, so that you covered all 8 across the qualification. So the sampling plan needs to be passed to the assessor to say what you want to see and when you want to look at it. And again, it depends on assessor qualification and experience. Periodically, I will look at, as an IQA, we'll look at my assessors probably once in 12 months for experienced assessors and do an observation with them. If it's a new assessor, there is a strategy in place, which I will show you at a later point, because that will match in with something else on Unit 2. That will show the training needs analysis of the assessors, where they're up to and what their qualifications are. So observation is done dependent on the level of experience of the assessor. Use of audio and visual technology. Yes, that is now becoming quite useful in certain qualifications. As an example, there are a number of people going through a level 6 qualification in the construction industry who've been doing their job as site managers for many years, but they haven't got a specific qualification, and the Sector Skills Council for Construction has said that this now should need to be done. Now, it's a very big qualification with about 19 units, and it's got to be, all the units have to be assessed, but there is a lot of cross-referencing from one unit to another. After discussions with me, the assessor decided that he would use basically video a session with each of the guys, and he would cover a number of areas each time of the units, and those will be done by professional discussion. This is where you've got a competent person in position who is going through the qualification process to achieve the qualification. He will have all the knowledge and experience. Yes, some documentary evidence will probably have to be collected, but it will probably be a minimum compared with the amount of time the assessor will spend in actual putting the audio-visual technologies together. Now, control units. Now, what are control units? This is where you may have a number of assessors who are assessing a qualification, a similar qualification, same level, same qualification. This is where you would say choose unit 1, just for argument's sake, and you would assess, you would look at the assessment on all the unit 1s to see that the assessment had been fair across the board by all the assessors. And obviously, if there are any issues there, then you pick those out quite easily. And that's what a control unit's there for, is to make sure that there is a fairness of assessment right across the qualification. I've done this several times in several establishments and found it to be quite useful in that it will pick up with experienced assessors probably small things that just can be discussed and sorted out. But with new assessors, you can see there's quite a fluctuation in the decision-making process on the assessment. And there we need to have a look at experienced assessors' work and how they've actually achieved their decision to help and support the new assessors. So that is basically what that is about. Now this is from Unit 2. It's about appeals, so it's appeals procedures, assessor communication, standards, learning objectives, interpretation, and awarding body EQA referral. Most of the time, in fact, none of the time, and I've been assessing now for over a long time, I have never had an appeal against a decision of mine from a learner. But sometimes, if I've not been, or I've looked at a criteria and I've thought to myself, I'm not actually sure what's being asked for here, it gives me the allowance myself, without going through the appeals procedure, I'll come back to that in a minute, to go back to the awarding body and the EQA and say, look, what does this mean? I don't understand that. Sometimes there are typos and mistakes in what the awarding body's put forward, and that happens occasionally. And it's always better to question what it actually means instead of making that decision yourself. It doesn't matter how much you experience you've got, it's very easy to pick up the wrong end of the stick on something and then pass that to your assessors and therefore to your learners, and it'd be wrong. So always, in the case of a decision where you're not 100% sure, you always go back to the awarding body. It's their qualification, it's them that makes the decision on what that will be. Again, standards, learning objectives, and interpretation. If you're assessing practical work, in other words, you may be doing witness testimonies, observations, question and answers, all that sort of thing in a practical-based establishment. It could be a workshop or an actual company. That interpretation is usually very clear. I've always said that if you're not sure about something, you go back to your awarding body. But interpretation is quite cut and dried. You need to do this, this, and this. That has to be done a certain number of times. This has to be fitted to 2,000th of an inch, or 2,000th of a millimetre, or whatever. It will have a specific objective. So it's quite easy for the assessor to see how to interpret that. In academic work, it's slightly different. You will have a degree of subjectivity, very small degree, but you always have that. And it allows you to make allowances for things for instance, if you've got, say, learners whose English is not very good, if they're writing something and you have issues with that, it may be that they need to do some further learning on their English, but it also, if you can understand, if you can make clear on what they've said, and you can see the understanding behind there, then that allows you to interpret that and make some adjustments for that particular issue. Back to Unit 1 again, to criteria and assessment. If I just look at the 3.2, explain the appropriate criteria to use for judging the quality of the assessment process. Well, that's a pretty easy one. The unit standards, the learning objectives, and the specific criteria are the only criteria that are used in the assessment process, nothing else. However, documentary evidence that fulfills our role, and this is where you will do this with the documentary evidence that you produce for Unit 2, you can also refer to that in Unit 1 when you're filling in the workbook. So the scope of the evidence, is it meeting the full criteria? Many a time now on academic work, it will give an indication of what the content should be. It will give probably a list of things. Not all of them need to be fulfilled, but mainly their ideas and directives really into which way the learner should be going or which research they should be doing. So that's making sure that it's fully meeting the standards and not just skimming the surface. This is where things we mentioned earlier, like the actual command verbs that are involved in there, making sure that those are met. That if it says analyse something, then it needs to be an analysis, not a list of things that should be there. Excuse me. So the scope of the evidence is it must meet fully the standard. Validity. Is it valid? Is it relevant to the criteria that are involved? And finally, is it authentic? Is it the learner's work? Now, we have a system whereby the learner actually signs a statement that this is their work, and obviously we have to go from that. But that composes the authenticity. Yeah. Another part of the IQA's job, again, is looking at, I mentioned this earlier, assessor training needs analysis. That can be done in a number of ways. They're looking at what their experience is in the particular area they're assessing in, to find out if there are any weak spots or areas that will need further training or further experience before they can be allowed to assess on a particular area. One of the issues sometimes there can be within a qualification, there may be criteria within it that the particular assessor who's assessing it is not qualified to do, and therefore anything he signed off will be invalid. An example of that was a large professional discussion had been taking place by the assessor on, again, it was on a site, a construction site, where the guy was managing and controlling lifts. And this is moving incoming materials from a wagon with a crane across to where it needed to go for the work to be done. There needs to be, or the assessor in that instance needs to have that qualification or be able to be, is qualified to assess the management of those lifts, because obviously it's a high health and safety area, and if you've got somebody signing somebody off that's not qualified, obviously it's not good news. I've had experience of that and had to cover in those instances. So assessor training needs analysis is quite important to make sure that they are fit and qualified to do the assessment process themselves. Verbal feedback. Verbal feedback, you used to be able to get away with saying, yeah, I've asked him this and I've asked him that and the answers were okay. It's now changed. Verbal feedback has to be recorded. It can be recorded in a report form, but it's easier to either video it or even audio, just an audio check on that is sufficient. Any IQA reports that have listed any issues that have cropped up with the particular assessor that will fire up the assessor training needs analysis. Again, interpreting standards, if the assessor has got any issues with interpreting the standards, it comes through to you as IQA to say, what do I do? Yeah, and it's your job then to either tell him what to do if you know, or obviously work with the awarding body to make sure that that is clarified. .2, we're looking at standardisation now. I mentioned before that IQA will have a strategy. I'm going to show you one of those shortly. But it will actually be in the Unit 2 section, that how the strategy is set up. Standardisation meetings. Right. A standardisation meeting is just that. If you looked at, I mentioned before earlier, I talked about control units. And those control units are part of a standardisation process, but not fully covering it. And even so, after you've got assessors that have been working on a particular job, certain qualifications for a number of years, it's sometimes good to pull a meeting together, and as IQA, it's up to you to organise this. And what I normally do is take a piece of work from a student or a learner that's complete, and that has had a decision made on it, and then pass that round to each of the assessors in the room and let them read the requirements of the qualification, what the learner has put, and then make a decision on that. It may be only one or two assessment criteria, but it looks at those specific ones on a unit and ask them to make a decision on what they've read. That can be quite interesting because you will set some assessors may decide, yeah, that's okay, I would sign that off. Others may say, no, I wouldn't sign that off. The process then, after we've done that, is to sit around the table and say, justify why you have made that decision. And it's a good learning curve then, because some assessors will look around and say, oh, I didn't realise that we could do that. Or somebody may say, well, yeah, I agree, I should have been a bit tighter on that because it's actually telling me that I need to see that in the qualification. And again, agreeing assessment methods and evidence requirements. So looking at what evidence is going to be required for the qualification or particular part of the qualification, and agreeing on how it's going to be assessed, so we all assess it the same way. There are several ways to assess many things, but sometimes there is the optimum way to do it to make it easier for everybody, the learner included, to get that evidence together. Again, decision disputes, dispute meetings, records, external quality assurance, and awarding body. A dispute meeting is where what would happen is if a learner had disputed an assessment decision, and it could be that he wants the work to be reassessed, in which case that is the IQA's job as the first stage. To look at the records, to look at the detail, to look at the assessment decision, why it was made, look at the standards, the assessment criteria, and make a decision on that. And the IQA, will say at that point, no, I agree with the assessor's decision, and that is it, basically. It may be that the assessor may have misassessed, in which case you will then take that up with the assessor, and sometimes it may be transparent if you have a meet with the learner at the same time. External quality assurance is the process where a number of decisions have been made by assessors. The internal quality assurer has made his reports on those assessors' decisions, and before certification can be administered, the external quality assurer from the awarding body will come in to look at a sample. They will normally say what they want to see before they come, and you can put the sample together for them, ready for them to appear. They will look at the sample, and they again will write a report at the end of that point to see whether they think the awarding body's qualification or the standards of it have been upheld. Jump now to 6.2, because again, these are what we've been talking about, methods of assessment and how we actually gather the evidence, or the assessor gathers the evidence. Photographs are fine to a certain point. I'll come back to that in a minute. Audio recordings are good for professional discussion. Video evidence is good if you've got somebody performing a job of work where they actually have to achieve something to a certain standard. Photography. We started to use as assessors photography some years ago now, and it was quite amusing at first, in that they would present a photograph with a number of people on it and say, that's such and such a body doing that, and there was absolutely nothing on the photograph except a bunch of people. I had to explain to the assessor, well, you know all these people, I don't. You need to say who the learner is, and you need to annotate basically the photograph with arrows and names and all the rest of it, and what they're actually trying to achieve in the photograph. That will then makes the photograph worth it. One of the other issues that cropped up is another method of gathering evidence called witness testimony. Now, I come from an engineering background, and the witness that would normally be looking at an apprentice, say, or a trainee, and giving the ideas on whether they completed it correctly or not, that's fine. But unless the person giving that witness testimony knows what the standards are and how they should be achieving that evidence, then it's not really worthwhile, and we have to put certain conditions in that on larger organisations somebody would be made apparent of all the standards, so they knew what they were going to be signing off for and why. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not an employer's in an employer's interest to sign something or agree that somebody's competent at something if they're not, because it's then they're going to be the loser in the long run. So the employers are usually quite good at giving witness assessments, but they must be aware of what they're actually giving that evidence for. This again refers back to some of the other parts of the unit, reviewing your own practice. It doesn't matter really how long you've been an IQA, there will be questions from assessors that you can answer, and there'll be questions from assessors that you can't answer. It may be that you need to interpret the standards between you, and you're quite comfortable with doing that, and that's okay from your own experience. But again, the EQA from the awarding body is your port of call. If you've got the slightest uncertainty, remember it is their qualification that you are delivering, and they should have the last word in any interpretation areas on any qualification. So, IQA functions, going back to 1.1. data collection, assessor training and support, planning and sampling, standardisation, EQA and awarding body contact. Those were always the functions of the internal verifier. With the IQA qualification, it's now changed slightly. Usually they change a lot of titles, but usually the meat and the sandwich is very similar. In this case, it's not, because they've now got management reporting. It's now become a really strategic position because as IQA, you are the first contact with the awarding body, with the learner, with the assessor, and also with the management. And it's liaison between those to make sure that any changes, any alterations, any deadlines for qualifications are actually reported back to management if things need to be changed, if anything needs to happen, where they need to make a decision with regard to changing procedure or anything of that nature. Those are the functions. Here's the principles. The management strategy, assessor training, monitoring and support, application and maintenance of standards and standardisation, and the completion of records. Now at all times there is, again as I've said, there's a management IQA strategy. Any assessor training, monitoring support is the IQA's responsibility. Application and maintenance of standards and standardisation is the responsibility of IQA, and the completion of any records. So that means that the system of IQA needs to be robust, but it also needs to be simple. Otherwise, I've seen very robust leaking systems that were quite complex, and half the paperwork didn't get filled in, so the records weren't complete, so it was no longer robust. So it needs to be user-friendly to all the people in the process. Otherwise, there's no point. So the principles of IQA are the strategy of the management, training, monitoring, support, application and maintenance of standards and standardisation, and the completion of all records. Principles, candidates, learners, assessors, methods of assessment, evidence, records, and assessment sites. CABRA. Yeah. Candidates and learners. The processes that go through that, I've put the different candidates and learners because learners are technically in an academic process, or that part of the qualification, the academic part of the qualification, they are learners. Candidates are people that were going through probably some form of practical qualification alongside of their academic one. And they are then candidates that are going to achieve particular skills as well as the knowledge. Assessors must be qualified in the area, are an experience in the area. That experience is more important, I think, in the area they're going to be doing the assessment in. The methods of assessment used, as we said before, these need to be agreed on a particular qualification and how you're actually going to deliver it and assess that process. How the evidence will be gathered and what will actually be needed as evidence. Excuse me. Any records that can be used as evidence to save a long-winded explanation of something. If you can produce a record that does a particular thing, you can just explain what it is and how it works. Assessment sites. Now that bit is perhaps more important for peripatetic assessors who go out into the workplace. There are a number of issues that become important if you're on site anywhere. The employer must know why you're on site and what you're coming for. You must be part of the plan to notify people when assessment takes place and get an agreed plan, so that the assessor going in, they know when he's coming, they know what he's going to be doing, and if anybody else is needed, then they're on hand to do that. So that will be where the assessment's done. It may be like a setup like we have here, where people are working through a qualification online. Then those records or the assessment sites will be electronic. The learner will send in work to the assessor, who will make the assessment and make the assessment decisions and send that back electronically to the learner and progress through formative to summative assessment. And finally, we'll look at the preparation. It's part of the IQA's responsibility to either register the learners on the qualification or be involved in the registration process if there's a registrar. So it's collecting the information about the learner, what they're doing, what they're going to be doing, that they're correctly registered, the communications between everybody involved, with the assessors, the IQA, the administrative management, who, when, where. This is going back to what I just said. And at the end of the day there, you will need to sort of collate all that together. So you have to work out what the resources are needed, any equipment that's needed, any costs in people and time. This is more specific to if you're assessing externally as well as internally, because internally you will have a fixed idea of those, but externally it will be a different matter. Hello.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Baron. I'm just coming to the end. I've recorded it though, so you're on record.
Right.
I've just finished that now, and it's got about all the different processes on. I've gone through that. Hang on, just put that on.